After the set of events that were set in motion on May 12th, around 10 a.m., on an island about 9 kilometers southwest of South City, Capsule Corp received a call from a certain farmer out west. He had found a strange vehicle with the company logo on it, and after further inspection, it was clear that a hole had been burnt out of the passenger compartment from the inside out. An abandoned moult and egg were found nearby, and the egg itself might have held no clues, but the empty moult was still fresh. Soon after, a place called Gingertown nearby lost all contact with the outside world. The government investigative team that was sent discovered that all of the town's residents had disappeared, an alarming incident that no one understood at the time. Well, no one but the god of Earth, who was watching from above the entire time. Despite his dark half, who also happened to be there, Piccolo, demanding an explanation, Kami refused to share what he saw. Instead, he immediately sacrificed his individuality and assimilated with Piccolo just for the chance to stop whatever was going on down below. When it comes to explaining exactly what makes Cell so different from every other villain in the series that came before him, including the seven that have been featured in this arc alone, there's a lot to talk about. Considering his impact on Piccolo and Kami's relationship, the way he pushes Trunks and Gohan in the future and the present, his dynamic with Goku, and his relationship with the narrative itself, it's almost hard to know where to begin. But the most natural starting point for this discussion has to be the simple, easy to understand fact that in Cell, we get at least 3 villains at once, not including Cell himself. For example, first form Cell runs the exact same playbook as Namek Saga Vegeta. After his confrontation with Piccolo in Gingertown, Cell lowers his energy, picks off towns one by one, then pinpoints the android's location by sensing Piccolo's energy after he starts fighting 17. Even the strength Cell gains by absorbing all of this life force calls back to Vegeta's sharp increase in power over the course of his guerrilla campaign against Frieza. These two even display their growth in similar ways. Both Cell and Vegeta have enemies that they fight twice, Zarbon and Piccolo. In their first fight, they're weaker than their opponent, but after they get stronger, they both win their fights in the same way. Piccolo and Zarbon end up getting holes blown through their torsos. The main difference here, though, is that we get to see a lot of Vegeta's progress on screen because he was indirectly helping the main cast in a way by picking off Frieza's henchmen. Cell, on the other hand, isn't helping anyone but himself, and the less we see of him, the better, because he's such a suspenseful character at this point. But that aside, once Cell transforms into a semi-perfect form, we get a completely different kind of villain who actually reminds me more of someone else. With Vegeta, Trunks, Goku, and Gohan all out of the picture after the group's initial loss to the androids, there was really only one reliable method of stopping Cell's momentum that he had built up at this point. Piccolo, the only person around who was strong enough, needed to destroy either 17 or 18 before Cell could absorb them. Of course though, this was never going to happen without Cell catching wind of Piccolo's energy and rushing to the battlefield, which kicks off another situation that we've seen before. Let's take a look at the Gauntlet Cell run starting in chapter 175 of the Dragon Ball Z manga and reduce it to its fundamental components. We got the protagonist with a clear goal being unexpectedly interrupted by the main villain of the arc. A fight ensues, of course, and then we get our first transformation from the villain, making things much worse for our heroes. Despite the villain getting much stronger, though, a bald human manages to hold them off through unconventional means, after which a new fighter arrives to the battlefield having gotten much stronger. Despite this newcomer's strength though, the villain transforms again, turning the tables once more. Does this sound familiar at all? We saw a fight with this exact same storyboarding on Namek, which introduces the idea of semi-perfect Cell being more similar to Frieza. In fact, there are aspects of Cell vs Piccolo 16, Vegeta, and Trunks that are just outright better than Frieza vs Vegeta, Gohan, Krillin, and Piccolo. For one, Cell's transformations having a requirement just makes things better. Everybody knows exactly what Cell's goal is, and they'll do anything possible to stop him. It's important to mention that stopping Cell is very possible here, which raises the tension. Frieza, on the other hand, can transform whenever he wants, which leaves things a little blurry and ambiguous. Vegeta outright asks Frieza to go into his second form, then he goes into his third for about 1 chapter against Piccolo, and by the time he's ready for his 4th form, the process has been noticeably cheapened. In comparison to Cell, who's actively on the back foot for a long time after Vegeta arrives and needs to transform to regain that upper hand, there's a clear improvement in how things are being handled. Perfect Cell isn't the result of a whim, he's the culmination of Krillin's mistakes, 18's refusal to flee, and most importantly, Vegeta's hubris. And these mini-fights aren't side notes either. Each person who takes a swing at Cell gets a good amount of time on panel to shine. Piccolo, 16, Tien, Vegeta, Trunks, everyone gets a good showing that tells us something about their character. Particularly those later fights with Vegeta and Trunks are standouts, but we'll talk more about that later in the video. For now though, let's get into who Cell becomes like after he absorbs 18 and achieves perfection. At this point, we've seen Cell sneak and we've seen him gain momentum, but he enters a completely different category once he outright achieves his goal. In fact, the only person we can compare him to at this point is the only other person who got what they wanted in the Dragon Ball manga, Piccolo Daimao. Both villains commit themselves to entertainment after gaining their desire, as Piccolo terrorizes the world and Cell decides to hold a tournament. We see both villains hop on a broadcast and tell the population exactly what they plan to do. Once the Cell games begin, we also get some references to Piccolo Jr. and the role he served in the 23rd World Martial Arts Tournament. Both Cell and Piccolo have anticipated matches with Goku that of course end up going very differently, but Cell even references the end of Goku's fight with Piccolo, saying that he'd hate for the fight to end with a ring out. Once again, Goku vs. Cell itself isn't a side note at all either. To me, this is one of, if not the most underrated fight in the series, for reasons I just can't fully get into without talking about Cell and Goku's dynamic more fully later on. But if you're still with me so far, you've pretty much heard me point out a lot of low-bearing fruit when it comes to Cell. Saying he's just like Vegeta, Frieza, and Piccolo is maybe the easiest thing to point out about this villain, and it's also probably the most controversial thing about him as well. These similarities are a big reason that people sometimes say that Cell is boring or unoriginal. In fact, in the community, Cell is kind of viewed as the beginning of the end when it comes to quote-unquote good Dragon Ball villains. When people want to explain why they don't like Bootanks or why they think Moro isn't good in Dragon Ball Super, they say that this villain is just a perfect Cell clone. And on paper, this does kind of make sense. Who would want to experience a copy of a copy? Upon closer observation though, to call Cell a copy is to only observe him on the surface level, which is an idea I'm hopefully going to be dispelling in today's discussion. So with that in mind, why do all the similarities we've covered so far really work? Is it really as simple as this idea worked before so it'll work again? The short answer is no, but the long answer requires some more context. First, we gotta stop looking at Cell as Toriyama's first flop or Toriyama getting tired and running out of ideas, and start thinking of him as the final villain of the series. Obviously, I don't mean that Cell is the literal last villain in Dragon Ball Z. Buu takes up that role, but when we look at the direction the story was going in, it's clear that the Cell saga serves as the resolution to everything that's been built up since the time skip. So with that in mind, Cell as the final villain of this story arc has to be important at the very least. If you're still not convinced that the Cell saga was guaranteed to be important, check this out. Toriyama tends to work in threes when it comes to story beats. Original Dragon Ball has 3 adventure arcs, Pilaf, Red Ribbon, and Piccolo Daimao. It also has 3 tournaments, the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Arcs also consistently feature trios like Goku, Bulma, and Oolong, or Goku, Krillin, and Roshi. This pattern continues into Z. 3 Saiyans come to Earth. Frieza and his initial henchmen form a trio. Gohan, Krillin, and Bulma, a trio, are the first to arrive on Namek, etc., etc. With that in mind, there's clearly going to be some importance to the Cell saga being the 3rd arc of this new section of the series, but there's more on top of that. In the pre-time skip, we watch Goku become the strongest under the heavens after winning the 23rd tournament, but after Namek, Goku is now being called the strongest in the universe. This comes with a few consequences, the first of which being challengers. As soon as he becomes the strongest, Goku is constantly approached by those who would take that title from him, people like Frieza and King Cold. Vegeta falls into this category as well, by the way, but fielding challenges isn't the only thing that comes with the kind of status Goku has now, because his fights were never about just strength. Because Goku was always fighting people who also happened to be evil, whether you want to talk about Piccolo Jr., Vegeta, or Frieza, these conflicts also put innocent people in danger in the process. Now, because Goku was always winning in the end, this was never a huge problem, but the Cell saga immediately raises the question of, what are we gonna do if Goku never shows up to the fight? We've seen him arrive late to save the day against Piccolo, Daimao, Nappa, the Ginyu Force, and Frieza, but what would everybody else do if Goku couldn't make it? On top of that, the controversial issue of how Goku chooses to deal with his enemies is also being scrutinized here, with the new threat of the androids originating from the Red Ribbon army that Goku destroyed all those years ago. I've covered that particular topic before in another video about Goku, but I want to make it clear that Goku's methods aren't even really the issue here. Jiro coming out of nowhere communicates the idea that it doesn't even matter if Goku spares his enemies or not, there's always going to be the possibility of someone else rising to take a past foe's place. So Toriyama, understanding the type of person his main character is, raises some good questions here that honestly any reasonable reader could have predicted or asked. Who's going to want to prove themselves against Goku next? Can Goku really be everywhere at once and make it to every fight on time? And does that even matter if more evil people can just follow in the footsteps of earlier villains? Fortunately, most of these questions end up getting answered by characters that are in the Cell Saga. If Goku can't be there, there's always going to be his son, Gohan, who's been developing into a hero in his own right over the course of Z. The Red Ribbon Army representing the sins of the father in a way being dealt with by Gohan in the end was really fitting, but of course, it wasn't that simple or easy. The stakes are high. We're not in space anymore defending a planet of Namekians that we don't really know. Now we're back on Earth facing a possible end of the planet over and over again. But on paper, that kind of sounds like the peak of the Saiyan saga, so to make things even more crucial, time travel comes into the picture. Now, we know that our heroes are supposed to lose, and they need to handle things differently this time around somehow. So hopefully I've begun to explain why this was kind of the perfect set of circumstances to resolve things, which starts to lay the foundation for why Cell himself needs to be special for the storyline to work. But you might have heard me go over all those things that are in the manga and had a thought. In the community, it's pretty popular to say that Toriyama planned to end the story after Cell, and as of this year, an interview with Torishima, Kondo, and Takeda, 3 editors who were very involved with the Dragon Ball manga during its runtime, have gone on record to say that yes, Toriyama expressed his intention to end the story here. Of course, this interview is pretty recent, with even the Kanzenshu website clarifying that Toriyama himself has never directly said anything implying this in any interviews, but now that we have this evidence, it pretty clearly supports what we've been discussing so far. What I will say though is that this recent interview is still a little vague. According to the team, Toriyama wanted to end the story here, but after strong pressure from them, he decided to continue, of course. So when exactly did he decide that he wasn't gonna stop? Was it early in the arc, in the middle, or near the end? This lack of context is a large part of why it never really mattered to me whether or not the story was planned to end here, especially when this idea is kind of used to bash the Buu saga sometimes. But with that in mind, it's actually a little bit more important to look into another editorial process that was happening during the Cell saga, that being Toriyama being advised to change his villains over and over again, which brings us into the execution of the arc and how all this setup actually plays out when it comes to Cell. First, let's start with the villains that Cell inadvertently replaces over the course of this storyline. Frieza and King Cold, for example, epitomize what's come before in the past. Just like the Saiyan saga escalated into Namek with the Saiyans being revealed to be foot soldiers of Frieza's empire, we get another very quick-paced escalation right here. It turns out Frieza was just a prince under the jurisdiction of a king who has many planets under his control. They arrive on Earth and wait for Goku, just like the Saiyans did, and they decide to hurt people in the meantime in a very similar way as well. Once Trunks arrives, we see King Cold become cowardly at the end of their fight, just like Frieza on Namek or Piccolo Daimo against Goku. In other words, this was a textbook Dragon Ball villain showcase condensed into a few chapters. These two were never going to be the main antagonists of this arc, but they set the stage for the androids pretty well. Unlike Cold or Frieza, Dr. Gero isn't a galactic emperor, and that aside, he's established to not even be truly relevant to what androids 19 and 20 end up doing after they kill him. In fact, the androids themselves, having been devised to enjoy slaughter and destruction according to Trunks, represent a new kind of villain, one more single-minded and less complicated than a Frieza or a Vegeta. In a way, you could call them pure in their pursuit of destruction. It's at this point that we have to acknowledge that Toriyama also said in an interview included in Shenlong Times #2 that he intended for these two androids, not 17, 18, or Cell, to be the main villains of the arc at this point. With Goku being the focal point of the questions being raised by the story, the villains needed to have a strong dynamic with him, and the purity of the android's enjoyment of slaughter is a pretty clear reflection of Goku's purity that Toriyama references in his famous interview about the poison that he wrote into his main character. Immediately, we're seeing an enemy that can be just as pure and single-minded as a Goku, just in a different way, which sets things up pretty decently for Gohan to defeat them in the future. But as we continue, we'll get into why this dynamic with Goku was actually handled better by Cell in the end anyways. That aside, the shift between 19 and 20 into 16, 17, and 18 was mostly for aesthetic reasons according to Toriyama and Torishima, so of course this new set of androids could serve a similar narrative purpose in theory. That is, if they were the same as 19 and 20, but of course they're different. Immediately, we see some differences. These new androids aren't killing for fun, and while they are still fixated on Goku, it's not really in the same way. They take their time looking for him, they fight other people, and they get different story beats like the beginning of Krillin and 18's relationship. If you ask me, this is where we start to see space being created for Cell, and this is why we get introduced to him soon after. With that in mind, let's talk about how clear it was that Cell was the endgame for this arc at this point. Immediately, as soon as Cell debuts, Piccolo and Kami rejoin to confront him. This was the resolution of something that had been established all the way back in original Dragon Ball, and if you want a deeper dive on that and Piccolo's character in general, I do have another video on the channel about that. Around the same time though, Cell's dynamic with Goku is being established. As Bulma exposits to Trunks about the second time machine, we learn that it was a mysterious vehicle with the Capsule Corp symbol that was found by a farmer out west. This is a pretty clear combination of aspects of Goku's introduction and background. The person who found the time machine being a farmer automatically reminds us of the farmer who found Raditz's spaceship during the Saiyan saga, and the location being in the west narrows our scope to Goku specifically, as he's very famously a Sun Wukong analog, making the west very important to his character symbolically. On top of all that, the time machine also has a Capsule Corp logo, which calls back to the modified Saiyan pod that Goku rode to Namek in. All the symbolism is just a really quick way to communicate to us that a person just like Goku, someone with Saiyan heritage who also has ties to Earth, has arrived in the story. In my Goku video, I talk about how this is the arc that Goku starts truly coming to terms with this joint influence, and it's no coincidence that Cell also has a similar combination of traits. Of course, the first move Cell uses against Piccolo is the Kamehameha, but the parallels really start to become clear once he reaches his perfect form. Immediately, Cell is asking questions about how Trunks and Vegeta got so strong so quickly and is willing to allow them to train for longer if they want. This is exactly how Goku treated Frieza after he beat him, sparing your enemy's life and letting them go train and go learn a few tricks. In fact, this parallel gets even deeper when you consider the fact that both Goku and Cell were fighting opponents in Frieza and Trunks who were using buff, powered up transformations that had drawbacks, and that both Goku and Cell point out these issues for their enemy, doing them a favor. That aside though, the build up to Goku versus Cell in the Cell game solidifies this dynamic even further for me. It's clear that both of these two are excited for this fight, and this honestly represents something completely new for Goku's character. Because he was always planning for Gohan to handle things in the end, he essentially gets the exact kind of thing that he would want, an uncomplicated fight with no holds barred. Goku's already reached his goal. He won the World Martial Arts Tournament, and he's being called the strongest at this point, so his fight with Cell is free to be exactly that, a fight. The choreography here is some of the best in the series, and we get amazing set pieces like the instant transmission Kamehameha and Goku's Ki Barrage at the end of the fight. That aside though, Cell isn't just composed of Goku's traits obviously, and there's one dynamic that I think is even more important than the one I just finished talking about. The reason Cell has DNA from Frieza, Piccolo, Goku, and Vegeta is because fundamentally he represents the old generation that both Trunks and Gohan are trying to replace. So let's talk about that next. For one, the time travel aspect of the Cell saga really serves to enhance this dynamic a whole lot. Cell of course is from the future just like Trunks, but why is that? For us to truly understand, we have to talk about Trunks' introduction. Frieza and King Cold are textbook Dragon Ball villains and escalations of what we've seen in the past, also that Trunks can be presented as what a good successor to Goku would look like in theory. We've all talked about how efficient Trunks is during this fight, how ruthless he is with Frieza and King Cold, and even he himself says that he's not soft like Goku. When the question of what would happen if a threat came to Earth and Goku couldn't make it in time is raised, Trunks arrives as the direct answer. But you may think this is kind of undermined by Goku dealing with Frieza on his own in the future timeline with instant transmission, or him saying he would have done the exact same thing in the main timeline. That's because despite all of Trunks' implications of him being a better protector for the Earth because he's not soft, he of course still needs Goku's help and admires his strength. After all, he gives Goku the medicine because he knows that keeping Goku alive is the key to changing things this time around. But upon closer inspection, this is only partially true, which brings us back to Cell, who killed Trunks even after he did everything right and saved the future, quote unquote, which brings up this question of who can really deal with this enemy. Of course, the answer to this question was right in front of us the whole time. Goku doesn't need to be alive because he's the strongest. He needs to be alive so that he can fully train Gohan and prepare him to be the strongest. It's at this point that Trunks stops being compared to Goku like he was in the early parts of the Cell saga and starts being compared to Gohan. They both go into the time chamber with their fathers, and in my Gohan video I talk a little bit more about some of the symbolism on display here, but that aside, after Trunks comes out, there's a whole plot line of him supposedly surpassing his father. He's confident he's done it, but he doesn't want to hurt Vegeta's pride. Of course though, because Trunks and Vegeta don't have a good relationship, Trunks' lack of experience blinds him to the shortcomings of his new strength, and he loses to Cell because he didn't have any help. Gohan, on the other hand, has a completely different experience with Goku in the Room of Spirit and Time. He comes out unsure of his own strength to an extent, not truly expecting to have to fight Cell. Goku though was always expecting to be surpassed, so in the end, Gohan is able to go all out without leaving anything behind. In this way, we get a protagonist who has completely surpassed the past generation, exceeding even the expectations of Trunks, who isn't even from this timeline and has knowledge of the future, but this all would not be possible without Cell, who is just like Gohan in a way. He's not just a copy of past villains, his abilities make him into a blank slate, with even Cell himself not fully understanding his abilities at times. Piccolo has to tell him that he can regenerate, and he's constantly wondering about what moves he can or can't use. Even the more controversial parts of Cell vs Gohan, like Cell's return, aid this dynamic. The person Cell kills ends up being Trunks, and he comes back with Goku's instant transmission and a Super Saiyan 2-like power-up. But that aside, these dynamics really aren't discussed in the community often enough. For Cell to be the source of all these parallels in this saga is extremely impressive, and it's pretty clear that he really does close out this part of the story in a perfect way. So with that in mind, if you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. You should probably think about subscribing, and let me know if you want to see more Dragon Ball videos in the future. Thank you for watching, and have a good day.